We just finished up a series in First John that we started back in October, and for many years now as the lead pastor, I've poked fun at myself, and we've all poked fun at me for these sermon series that feel like they're never going to end. It was a 5-chapter book. It took us 20 weeks of preaching to go through the book of First John, but partway through, as I started feeling self-conscious, I just felt like, you know what? Why does it matter? We're just going to learn from the Word of God, and it'll take us where it takes us. And so we finished up last week. This week, we're going to start a 3-week series called Famous Last Words. We're going to launch into it this morning in the book of Mark, and in Mark chapter 11. So as we do that, I want to just give you a little bit of an idea where we're going. Mark 11 this week, Luke 24 next week, and Acts chapter 1 in a couple of weeks. Some of you, the most astute among us, may be saying, wait a minute, how can those all be his last words? And most of you might be thinking, well, aren't his last words, it is finished? How are we? We're not necessarily looking at his actual last words. But let me give you some context for the book of Mark, where we're picking up. Loosely, the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, splits into kind of 2 sections. The first 10 chapters of the Gospel of Mark cover the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, the first 3 years of Jesus' ministry. But when you get into chapter 11 through chapter 16, those final 6 chapters cover 1 week of Jesus' life. So Mark, who is short on words, he is one of the most concise of the writers of the New Testament, took 425 verses in the first 10 chapters to talk about the first 3 years of Jesus' ministry. And then he took 253 verses to cover 1 week in Jesus' life. And I think that shows us a picture of the importance of that week of Jesus' life. And Mark understood that. He grasped the fact that that week defined all of Jesus' mission and ministry. All of the previous 33 years of his life built up to that final week of ministry. And so where we pick up in Mark chapter 11 is a familiar story. Now, Mark is one of what is called the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called such because they kind of create a well-comprehensive version, picture of Jesus' ministry, and they share a lot of the same stories and information and facts with us. And then there was this other guy, John. We just read his first epistle. He had to be different because there's always one, right? And John, he talked about a lot of stuff that the other 3 didn't. He actually serves to kind of fill in color between the lines a little bit with his gospel. Some people have said that the Gospel of Matthew focused on what Jesus said. The Gospel of Mark has focused on what Jesus did. The Gospel of Luke focused on what Jesus felt. And the Gospel of John focused on who Jesus was. Mark just jumps right in. He's an action guy. In fact, the word immediately appears an inordinate number of times in the 16 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. But there's a few stories that are covered in all 4 Gospels. There's 10 to be exact, but we'll strip it down, kind of combine some things, and put it into 4 or 5 stories. The first is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. All 4 Gospels cover that. And then all 4 Gospels tell us the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000. That might be a story you're familiar with. A bunch of people on a hillside, not enough food to go around. Little boy shows up, 5 loaves, 2 fish, and all of a sudden, Jesus does a miracle, and there's 12 baskets of food left over after feeding all of these people, which, by the way, as it has often been said, the count was typically a count of men, not a count of individuals. And so many theologians and scholars have speculated that it was far beyond 5,000 that were actually fed that day. But this is one of Jesus' multiplication miracles, the feeding the 5,000 that we read about in all 4 Gospels. Also, Jesus predicting his betrayal, right? When we read about the Last Supper and the moments where Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. Who is it, Lord? It's the one who dips his bread into the cup with me. And then Judas gets up, as we know because we have the benefit of hindsight. Judas gets up and goes to the Pharisees, to the teachers of the law, and to the chief priests, and sells out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Then there is the death, or the arrest, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, right? Certainly if I asked you to guess what stories are covered of Jesus in all 4 Gospels, that would have been the first one, right? Everybody would have gone to that. But there's one more, and that's where we're going to pick up today in Mark chapter 11, and it's the Triumphal Entry. This is a moment for Jesus that at times maybe, and please bear with me when I say this, maybe it can feel a little bit underwhelming or at least a little bit confusing in a sense, because it's just very different than most of the rest of the ministry of Jesus that we read about and hear about. There's like, in Mark, there's like 6 verses about donkey acquisition that Mark spends time talking about finding this donkey, which feels a little disjointed in a sense. There's people that are waving shrubbery and shouting in a different language. It seems like it's just kind of chaos and confusion, and there's an immense amount of symbolism in this story, but symbolism's really only good if you understand the symbols, right? So let me put it to you this way. If I told you, now I'm from Pittsburgh, so the Grand Concourse is a super fancy restaurant at the bottom of Mount Washington in Pittsburgh. And so if I told you that a guy took a girl to the Grand Concourse for dinner, and they got all dressed up and they ate dinner, and then they rode the incline, which is a little trolley car that goes up the mountain, up to Mount Washington, and they walked over to one of the overlooks, and this is some of the most beautiful views of Pittsburgh, and they're at night, and the guy gets down on one knee, and he pulls out a little dark velvet box, and he opens it up, and you would understand. Then he gets up and celebrates, and they're all excited, and they go back down the incline, and maybe they meet up with family, or the creeper that was taking pictures for Facebook while he was proposing to her. We would understand exactly what's happening. But if you lived in a remote country, if you were from a culture that was not like ours, you'd be thinking, why are you going to this restaurant? What is an incline? Why are you on a knee? What is this jewelry and this box? What is happening? Because you don't understand the symbols. And oftentimes, that's how we read through the Bible, because we live in a different culture than these words were penned and written. And so it's inherent that it's a necessity for us to dig in to try to understand the symbols, and there is a mess of stuff that Jesus is saying without even speaking a word in some ways in Mark chapter 11. He starts off this way. When they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and told them, "Go into the village ahead of you. As soon as you enter it, you will find a colt there on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here right away.'" So they went, and they found a colt outside in the street, tied by a door. They untied it, and some of those standing there said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" They answered them just as Jesus had said, so they let them go. They brought the colt to Jesus and threw their clothes on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their clothes on the road, and others spread leafy branches cut from the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." He went into Jerusalem and into the temple. After looking around at everything, since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So there's a lot of symbolism here, and Jesus speaks no words to the crowd as he enters Jerusalem, but with his actions, he speaks volumes. Now, Scripture tells us that they approached Jerusalem near at Bethphage and Bethany, near Jerusalem, near the Mount of Olives. Now, Jesus and his disciples at this point were coming from Jericho. If you're reading through the Gospel of Mark, pretty much, this is loose, but pretty much what happens is at one point in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and his disciples end up in Tyre and Sidon, which is about as far north and west as you can get in Israel, and then it just becomes a straight march for Jesus to Jerusalem because he knows what's coming. And so as we get to this moment, they have come from Jericho. Jericho is to the south and to the east, and they're making their way to Jerusalem. As they approach, they come to this place called Bethany. And Jesus says to his disciples, "Hey, we need to get a donkey." Now, there's a couple little interesting things here that we don't understand maybe on the surface, but let me give you a little bit of geography very quickly. Bethany is located east of Jerusalem. I guess maybe it's sort of what Beach Haven is to Berwick. I don't know, in a very, very twisted sense, because it's different certainly. But this would be where Jesus' home base was for this entire week leading up to his crucifixion and burial. But in Ezekiel chapter 11, this is what we read. This is the story of Ezekiel receiving a vision of God's glory. Now, God's glory used to live in the Holy of Holies, which was in the center of the temple, and the temple was in the center of Jerusalem. And so this was the physical location of the presence of God on earth in the Old Testament. And Ezekiel's given a vision where God shows him and speaks to him about how corrupt and how faithless and sinful the Israelites have become. And he said, "I can't tolerate it anymore. I'm leaving." Paraphrase, but that's loosely what it says. And so what Ezekiel sees in chapter 11 is the glory of the Lord depart from the temple of God. And it departs through the eastern gate to the eastern mountain and then leaves Jerusalem. And following this, God's judgment comes on the nation of Israel. But Ezekiel and God, even in that moment, didn't leave Israel without hope, because we read towards the very end of Ezekiel, chapter 43, verses 1 through 5, it says this, that God led Ezekiel to the gate, the one that faces east, and I saw the glory of God, of the God of Israel, coming from the east. His voice sounded like the roar of a huge torrent, and the earth shone with his glory. The vision I saw was like the one I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the ones I had seen by the Kebar Canal. I fell face down. The glory of the Lord entered the temple by way of the gate that faced east. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So Zechariah tells Israel that the Messiah's feet would touch down on the eastern mountain, the mount to the east of Jerusalem, and that the glory of God would return to the temple. And Ezekiel says that it will come from the mountain to the east. And Jesus' actions are grabbing this imagery because Bethany was at the base of the Mount of Olives, the mountain to the east of Jerusalem. The Messiah had come. And then Jesus tells his disciples, go into the village ahead of you, tells them where to find this donkey that's going to be tied up, and if anybody gives you any trouble when you look like you're trying to steal this donkey, tell them the Lord needs it, and they'll let you take it, and you just bring it to me. Now, there's a lot here that is also kind of different. If you've ever read through Mark and paid attention to the patterns that Mark gives us of Jesus, a lot of Jesus' ministry was responsive. That's not me saying that Jesus was aimless or that he was purposeless, but simply that it's often told in the Gospel of Mark that somebody would bring someone to Jesus and he would heal them. Someone would bring somebody to Jesus and he would do something for them. But here, Jesus clearly appears to be kind of on the more intentional, offensive side, if you will, of things. He's got a plan and he wants his disciples to be on the same page and help carry this plan out. Now, Jesus walked just about everywhere. This was common for Israelites, particularly for rabbis, and particularly for those who were pilgrims to Jerusalem, faithful Jews that would make their way to Jerusalem, to the temple, around the time of the Passover. They didn't ride, they walked everywhere. It was custom. But this time, Jesus says to the disciples, guys, I'm riding in. Now, I don't know about you, but there were moments in high school and in college when I'd be together with a bunch of my friends and somebody would have an idea and they'd pipe up and say, guys, this is what I think we're going to do. And all of a sudden there was this bravado and excitement and probably raging testosterone in that group of guys, and we're like, yeah. And I can only imagine in that moment that when Jesus told the disciples, boys, I'm riding in, they knew exactly what he meant. They knew exactly what he meant. Now, the steed on which he would ride was very specific, and it was very special. And to us, it may feel a little silly, but it was specific because it was the majestic donkey, unlike any other creature. Well, maybe not. Rather inglorious, but yet we would be wrong if we felt that way. It was special because it was a donkey on which no one had ever ridden before. Now, in sacrificial law, when you offered a sacrifice or an offering to the Lord, you had to use an animal that had never been used for a common purpose. That was what was considered holy and set apart for the Lord. And so Jesus is using an animal that has been set apart, has never been used for a common purpose. Now, pretty much for the first time in his public ministry, it feels, Jesus speaks of himself overtly as the Lord. Think about the number of times maybe you've read in the Gospels, whether it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke, where Jesus heals somebody and says, shh, don't tell anybody. Because he knew that it wasn't time, but on this day it was time. And he says, tell them the Lord needs this donkey. In Genesis chapter 49, we read this prophecy. These are some of the final words of Jacob, Israel, over his son Judah. And he says this in Genesis 49:10, the scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes. And the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. He ties his donkey to a vine, and the colt of his donkey to the choice vine. So in this moment, Jesus tells his disciples, the scepter has finally come to the rightful hands. Now go get my donkey. That sounded a little bit like Shrek, sorry. But he says, now go get my donkey, go get my steed. And so this is very different because Jesus had spent so much time not necessarily hiding who he was, but he knew the moment was not right. Because all of Israel perceived the Messiah would be one type of leader, but Jesus was a very different type of leader than what they expected and anticipated. And so the disciples that go, they get the donkey, they throw their clothes on it, and this as well is prophetic fulfillment. In Zechariah, we read in chapter 9, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, humble, and riding on a donkey." On a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so Jesus says to his disciples, boys, I'm riding in. And they know exactly what this means. And so as they go into Jerusalem through the eastern gate, many people begin spreading their clothes on the road, and others start spreading leafy branches, palm fronds, palm branches that are cut from the fields. And this was seen in the Old Testament before. And in Kings, we see Jehu, as he's coronated and becomes king, he rides in and they throw clothes on the ground and they throw leaves and branches on the ground to pave the way. Now, when there wasn't a red carpet in that day and age, people would typically throw their best clothes, their best garments on the ground, on the road, in front of the king who was riding in. A triumph in that day was typically reserved for a king who was coming in after having conquered. A king who was coming in to celebrate his victory and to receive the adulation and the adoration and the praise from his adoring, loyal people in that city. And so as Jesus rode in, people began to throw their cloaks and their clothes and the palm branches on the ground, saying, the king is here, the king is coming, and he is worthy. And they began to shout, Hosanna, which means, God, save us. Those who went ahead followed and shouted, Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. This is actually from Psalm 118, which is widely recognized, not just in today's day and age, but even by ancient Israel as a messianic psalm, one that prophesied, spoke ahead of the coming of the Messiah. In verses 25 and 26, it says, Lord, save us. Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord, we bless you. Now, just for a moment, if I can step away from teaching a hair, isn't this something that we all want? Isn't this something that's kind of deep down inside of all of us? This longing for a hero, this longing for a deliverer, for a king, for a leader, someone to come and fix things, to make things better. If you don't believe me, what about, and maybe I'm speaking mostly to men, I hear me, but I understand that. But if you don't believe me, think about the movies to which you buy tickets or that you rent on Amazon when you stream them. This is Lord of the Rings, and Aragorn has come to sit on his rightful throne of Gondor, and I'm looking at a room full of people that is blank-faced and glassy-eyed and has no idea what I'm saying. So let me try again. This is Rey in Star Wars. That's a little better. This is the Black Panther and the noble right one who sits on the throne of Wakanda. Nothing? Anybody? All right. Harry Potter, who lays down his life for Hogwarts. Okay. This is everyone's favorite Christmas movie, Die Hard, where John McClane saves a bunch of people from terrorists in Japan who took over the Nakatomi Tower. But we watch these movies over and over and over because there's built into us a desire to find a hero, a desire to find a king. In fact, I believe it's Ecclesiastes says that God himself has set eternity in the hearts of all men. And it's built into us by the Creator himself. And so in this moment, Jesus is saying, hey, I know you've been looking a lot of places, but the hero that you're looking for, the king that you're looking for, he's here. It's me. I'm the true king. I heard another pastor share this thought, and it's really good. And so as you hear me say king this morning, some people embrace that. And there's a hallelujah and an amen that raises up in our spirits. But for some, we recoil. Because king means control. And I don't want nobody telling me what to do and how to live my life. Some of us don't want that. Some of us don't want to be controlled. Some of us don't want anybody telling us what to do. But that's just not who Jesus is or what he was saying. In fact, he's saying something very, very different. So let's flash back just for a moment to verse 2 in Mark 11. It says this, that he told the disciples to go into the village ahead of you. As soon as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. Skip down to verse 7. They brought the colt to Jesus and they threw their clothes on it. And he sat on it. Now, what tends to happen when you jump on an animal that has never been ridden before? Right? I'm not much of a cowboy. All I know about horses is that I like one end better than the other. My wife loves horses and taught me a lot that I've now since forgotten since we live in Berwick. But the very first time I ever tried to get on a horse, I was standing on the left side of the horse and I put my right foot in the stirrup. Some of you were like, so what? Then you wind up like this. Okay, so I need to finish that one because some people weren't connecting the dots. But that's kind of how things started. Now, I once, many, many times actually, went riding with my wife. Long before she was my wife, I was trying to woo her because I was incredibly attracted to her. And so for me, horseback riding was the way to get there. And I can remember one time we were riding kind of down through this clearing, and she's like, do you want to run with the horses? I said, okay. So she kicked her horse and took off, and mine just went and took off. I was like, oh, maybe this is a bad idea. Fortunately, she was able to kind of settle things down, and I'm still here. But the truth of the matter is that a horse that has been saddle trained knows whether you have a clue what you're doing or not. And I couldn't fool any of those horses. Now, I also, because my wife worked at a horse farm, I got to watch her green break and saddle break horses. It was a horse racing farm, and before these yearlings would get shipped out, she would work with them to get the saddle on them. Because even putting a saddle on a horse that hasn't been ridden before is a task. It takes weeks and sometimes even months just to get the saddle on there, much less a person in the saddle. And so Jesus says, bring me this colt that's never been ridden before. And I can only imagine if it was me that was a disciple thinking, okay. So not only is Jesus riding a never ridden before donkey, he's riding it through a screaming, frenzied crowd, a throng of people with chaos and confusion everywhere. They're throwing coats on the ground, they're waving shrubbery, and they're throwing their hands in their air, and they're yelling. Guess what? The donkey was fine. Why? And this is what the other pastor said. Jesus didn't break the donkey. He healed it. Tim Keller says this little colt is fearless in the face of a screaming crowd when Jesus is in the saddle of his life. In a messianic prophecy in Isaiah chapter 11, we read these words. The wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf, the young lion, and the fattened calf will be together, and a child will lead them. The cow and the bear will graze, their young ones will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like cattle. And I want to share this from my heart for those who might recoil at that word king when we describe Jesus. He's not a controlling king, he's a comforting king. He's a calming king, he's a healing king. And he's the king not just of people, but he's king over nature, and he's king over all creation. And this donkey that had never been ridden was in complete peace with Jesus, as Tim Keller said, in the saddle of his life. Worship team, would you come this morning? So just as the curtain is closing on Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, we read that he goes into the temple, looks around, and since it was late, he went back to his home base in Bethany. And it was normal, it was common for a king in those days to come in either on a white horse or in a chariot that was pulled by white horses. They would proceed through the center of the city and then into the temple where he would offer sacrifices and participate in some form of worship. And so we see Jesus doing that very same thing. But I want to back up just a little bit this morning. I want to back up to Jesus and this donkey. Jesus declaring, "The king that you're looking for, I am he." You know, I think many of us are worried. We're wondering how we're going to survive the chaos of life, how we're going to break down these barriers between us and a life of peace, how we're going to achieve a life full of contentment and rid of anxiety. How are we going to defeat and destroy the demons that are threatening our very addiction, our very existence? Maybe it's through addiction or through compulsion, through anger or bitterness or resentment. And I think there's a lot of people asking, how can I make it? How can I change? How can I just put out the dumpster fire that is the life in which I'm living? Truth is that we look to a lot of things to be our heroes. We look to a lot of people to be our heroes, to be our conquering king, to be the deliverer for the difficulties, the hardships, the heartaches, the hurts, the habits, the hang-ups of our life. But those things become albatrosses. Those things become addictions to us. Those things are misplaced loves, because even good stuff can make a very, very bad God. The stress of life and the problems and the difficulties, they still press down on us. They still leave us wondering, am I going to crack? Am I already cracking? Or maybe sitting here this morning, you're wondering to yourself, how can I recover from things that have left me shattered, broken, wounded? And the answer is the same today as it was 2,000 years ago on the first Palm Sunday. An unridden donkey walked completely at peace into a screaming, chaotic, frenzied crowd, because Jesus was in the saddle of his life. He was at complete peace, not because Jesus broke him miraculously, but because Jesus healed him, because Jesus restored him, because Jesus put him back together. And today, I really believe that Jesus wants to lead you. He wants to lead me just like he led that donkey. He wants to lead you just as he led the crowd, just as he said to the crowd, I'm here. The king is here. And I'm not a controlling king. I'm a conquering king. I'm a calming king. I'm a peaceful king. I'm a healing king. I want to put you back together. And so as we prepare to worship this morning and celebrate who Jesus is in this week of his life, I want to encourage you. If that's you and you're sitting here and you say, I'm not really all that put together. In fact, there's really none of me that's put together. I'm broken. As we start this series, Famous Last Words, the thing that Jesus wants you to hear is that your hero, your conquering king, your Messiah has arrived. And he wants to heal you and put you back together.